So, good morning, one and all, those who have joined in this session. And at the very outset, let me request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Vidyut Chakraborty sir, to preside over the session. And may I also request our VC sir to introduce the session. Sir, please.
আমি কিন্তু খুব দ্বিধায় আছি যে বাংলায় বলবো না ইংরেজিতে বলবো, কারণ ঐশ্বর্য is one of the rare speakers in our lecture series who is comfortable both in Hindi, English and Bangla, perhaps Hindi also, because he was a student of JNU. Anyway, I'll speak in English because the mode of lecture will be in English. And you know, as you know, today I put before you that Aishwarya is not a non-Bengali, he's a Bengali. So that was a kind of disclosure which, you know, you didn't know, nobody knew about it. I know Aishwarya as a scholar, to be very frank with you, because, you know, when I read his book, Radical Equality, I was really terribly excited, simply because here is a historian who is also a political theorist. So I was so excited and I got in touch with him, and then I reviewed the book in 3 places. First, it was Pioneer that brought out the review, and then Indian Historical Review, and then finally Economic and Political Weekly. And to be very frank with you, that this is one of the best books. You know, I'm not appreciating Aishwarya because he's in front of me. I also wrote that in my review. This is one of the best books on Ambedkar. And the book was so persuasive that, you know, I started writing a book on Ambedkar, which was basically an attempt to focus on the ideas which Ambedkar put forward. Aishwarya's is a very fantastic interpretation of how Ambedkar saw the notion of equality. I mean, you know, the title of the book, as you know, is Radical Equality and on Indian democracy. Now, this radical equality is also a kind of conceptual formulation which fits in perfectly well with Ambedkar's thought, because Ambedkar was keen to establish equality, not in the form of, you know, constitutional equality, but his equality was a little different in the context of India, in which equality means discrimination as well. So Aishwarya's book is one of those kind of, you know, very strong endeavors at establishing the point that equality has got multiple meanings, and equality has got multiple meanings simply because it is to be interpreted with reference to the context. And Aishwarya brought about the context pretty well. And I would request all those who are participating in this lecture should go through the book, and I have requested our librarian to get the book as quickly as possible. That's one. And secondly, you know, Aishwarya is a prolific writer, and a rare kind of writer, because, you know, he always brings out new ideas which may not appear to be relevant in today's context, which may not appear to be conducive to our thinking. In other words, it is very unconventional or non-conventional. Non-conventional thinking, Aishwarya is, you know, really expert at it. And that is what also impressed me a lot, because, you know, I mean, at the fag end of my career, you know, I'm very happy to have the scholars like Aishwarya who always thinks out of the box. And that's most important nowadays. Instead of following the conventional ideas of historiography, Aishwarya is one of the rare historians, rare analysts, rare political theorists who tries to put forward newer ideas, nuanced ideas in a completely different kind of context. So his book, to me, is not only a pioneer of new kind of thinking, but also a stepping stone towards newer ideas, and also provocative to the scholars to think differently. Now, I know everybody is waiting to listen to Aishwarya, so I should not stand in between you and Aishwarya. But my request to you, Aishwarya, that, you know, because it's 11 o'clock here in India, most of the students are busy in their classes. Now the exam also has started, so, you know, our students will be deprived of your lecture. So my request to you, if you can accommodate, you know, to our students, you know, kind of curiosity, later day, you know, if you do it later in the afternoon, because it's 9 o'clock. So if you can do it at 2:30, then here will be about, you know, 7 o'clock in the evening. It will still be better for the students to join. And I want the students to join, because here most of them are teachers and senior faculty members. So I would like you to talk to the students. That's one request to you. Aishwarya, please keep that in mind. And secondly, you know, whoever gives lecture in this series, you will be, I think, 47th or 48th, I don't remember. We immediately accept him or her as member of the Visva-Bharati Paribar. Now, once you become a member of Visva-Bharati Paribar, you have to come to Visva-Bharati physically. That's something, that's a commitment which you have to give. Or if you don't give, I give the commitment on your behalf to all of them. So I think whenever you get a chance, whenever you come to Bengal, please let us know. We will be happy, we'll be honored to host you in this, you know, famous and a campus which is associated with the name of an illustrious son of India, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. So you please do come whenever it's convenient, whenever you come out of the land of the plenty and come to this land of the poor. We'll be happy to welcome you and we're happy to host you. And the third request is that whoever gives lecture, we normally upload his or her lecture in the website. I hope you have no objection if we upload this lecture in the website, because then the students who will miss it today, they will have a chance to listen to your lecture. So if you give us a kind of kind of formal approval, just virtually, we'll be happy to do that. So we'll upload it immediately after the lecture is over. Now with these few words, again I thank you very much. আমি তোমাকে অজস্র ধন্যবাদ দিচ্ছি এবং ভগবানের কাছে প্রার্থনা করি যে তুমি আরো ভালো কাজ করো, তুমি আরো লোকজনকে ভাবাতে শেখাও, এবং শুধু আজকেই নয় ভবিষ্যতেও যেন তোমার এই র্যাডিক্যাল ইকুয়ালিটি বই একটা ক্লাসিক্যাল পিস হিসেবে দাঁড়ায় এবং দাঁড়াবেও, আমার ধারণা দাঁড়াবেও। এই বলেই আমি থামছি এবং যারা এসছেন তাদের প্রত্যেককে আমি ধন্যবাদ দিচ্ছি, কারণ এই সময়ে লেকচার শোনাটা একটু আমাদের পক্ষে একটু ডিফিকাল্ট। তা সত্ত্বেও ঐশ্বর্য is so popular lecturer, so I'm sure you will be benefited with his intervention. ভালো থেকো ঐশ্বর্য, ভগবানের কাছে প্রার্থনা আবার করি তোমার জন্য, আর সবাই ভালো থাকুন। এই বলে আমি আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করছি। তবে ঐশ্বর্য আমাকে হয়তো মাঝে মাঝে বেরিয়ে যেতে হতে পারে কারণ মিটিং এর জন্য, প্লিজ ডোন্ট মাইন্ড। থ্যাংক ইউ নিমাই। শুভায়ু।
Yes.
Please take care about the session. Subhayuda.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now I formally welcome Professor Kumar to this 48th lecture series of Visva-Bharati lecture series. He's a professorial fellow in Philosophy, History and Government, Stanford Global Studies, Center for South Asia, Stanford University. Professor Kumar, an intellectual historian and political theorist, has interest in South Asian, American, European political thought. His works engage a wide spectrum of issues in moral and political philosophy, constitutional theory and political justice, history of democratic thought and rights. As Professor Chakraborty has already mentioned, he has authored Radical Equality, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Risk of Democracy, a very important work that was published in 2015. And as many of us know, that his work, Radical Equality, was listed by the Indian Express among the 15 most important books on politics and morality to be published that year. Professor Kumar has been recipient of fellowships in Germany, Switzerland, and UK. He has published in many journals of repute like Modern Intellectual History, Public Culture, Social History, Contemporary South Asia, Seminar, etc. I, on behalf of Visva-Bharati Purivar, now request Professor Kumar to deliver his talk. Professor Kumar.
Thank you so much. Is the audio clear?
It's little low.
ব্রেক করছে, তোমার ভয়েসটা ব্রেক করছে।
Okay, let's get this going and see.
Yes, now it's fine.
Yeah. So, what can I say other than firstly thanking from my heart Professor Chakraborty for inviting me to deliver this prestigious lecture at such an illustrious institution. I'm happy and honored to be part of it, to be part of this broader intellectual community of thinkers that dates back to such a long and illustrious period in modern Indian political and intellectual life. So I'm really, really grateful to be here with all of you. It is, as Professor Chakraborty mentioned, slightly disappointing even for me that I'm unable to speak to as many students at Visva-Bharati as I would have actually wanted to. And as he just mentioned, we would try and find a way to rectify that situation, and at some point soon I would actually love to talk to students there. That's one of the most exciting things we do as scholars. Not only write for people who are engaged and invested in specific questions that we engage with and deal with, but also to younger minds who bring up new ideas and new perspectives, not to mention new dimensions to those ideas. So it will be my privilege to find a time when I can interact with the many students who might be interested at Visva-Bharati. What I wanted to do today is tease out just one specific dimension or thread in B.R. Ambedkar's political and moral thought. And that, as the title suggests, is the question of human freedom. Now, I want to begin with an anecdote which illustrates why this question, at least to me, becomes important. I was in a workshop in New York in 2009, and at that time I was working on, as Professor Chakrabarti very generously mentioned, working on the relationship between inequality and violence in anti-colonial traditions. India is a major part of that tradition, of course, but I was also looking at these two figures, Gandhi and Ambedkar, beyond the nationalist construction of their encounter. A nationalist construction in which they're often seen as adversaries, which they might or might not be at all points, but the point was that their thought brought out, it was precisely in the incommensurability of their thought that the new critique of violence and a new critique of human indignity and inequality appeared. It was through their incommensurable approach to the problem of inequality. But I was struck even back then when someone like Ambedkar was not even taught in many, let alone American or European institutions, even in Indian institutions, something like annihilation of caste was not even taught that broadly. And I'm walking with a very renowned political scientist, theorist in New York right after the workshop. And he asked me very harmlessly, he asked me, so tell me, you were speaking of how Ambedkar is engaging with Thomas Hobbes and John Stuart Mill, but does he really think about what really concerns these thinkers in the European tradition? Does Ambedkar really think about human freedom at all? And it struck me that part of the problem, the very burden of Indian political theory, if it exists in that sense, was that it was never able to move out of certain frameworks that would allow us to engage with Ambedkar as a thinker of political freedom, as a thinker of servitude and liberty at the same time. And I returned to that question, of course, during the finishing of Radical Equality, but that question has stayed with me. And the question that has stayed with me can be formulated very simply in these words. If it were true that Ambedkar actually thinks about human freedom, why is it so difficult for a certain mold of Indian political and moral philosophy, Indian moral universe itself, to comprehend and grasp that thinking of freedom? A. And B, what would Ambedkar's conception of freedom look like? So with these two questions in mind, and with these two questions as bookends for the lecture, I want to propose two threads that connect these bookends. Firstly, it is difficult for so many established scholars of Indian political thought and Indian political theory to comprehend or grasp, let alone touch or approach Ambedkar as a thinker of human freedom. Because by and large, the anti-colonial tradition has concerned itself with only two fundamental problems. A, the problem of national self-determination. Much of the anti-colonial tradition of political thinking has remained concerned, centrally focused on the question of national self-determination. The one defining and perhaps the only struggle that matters to this way of thinking about democratic politics, in fact, democratic life, is India's struggle for independence. So much so that that struggle for independence has swallowed our very capacity to think about freedom as something that is distinct from and supersedes self-determination. The freedom that Ambedkar thinks about, and in this I would put a host of other global figures who will figure later on in our discussions, I hope. Some will figure in the lecture itself. But Ambedkar is among that broader global constellation of thinkers who refuses to reduce human freedom, the problem of human freedom, to the question of national self-determination. And one effect of this immense power of national self-determination over our political imaginary, over our social imaginaries, has been that we have simply failed to and eventually given up on thinking about freedom as that which is very distinct from autonomy and from self-determination. The second point, the second obsession, let us say, and I'm using a deliberately provocative word here, but by and large, Indian political theory and political science has been concerned with the question of the state. The effect of colonialism on all post-colonial and anti-colonial thought was so powerful that once the colonial state left, it left behind a way of thinking about democratic politics in which the state remained the primary, even compulsive center of all thinking of politics. So on the one hand, we saw the consolidation of a political of a consolidation of a way, I wouldn't call it a tradition, but a way of thinking about democratic politics that was concerned solely with the heroism and the triumphs of the anti-colonial struggle. And on the other hand, was a way of thinking about politics that simply could not extricate itself from its obsession with the modern and the post-colonial life of the Indian state. It's because of these two primary compulsions in anti-colonial and post-colonial political theory. In fact, post-colonial political theory does not even exist. Post-colonial theory has been by and large concerned with the question of culture and social life, perhaps, but not in the old Marxian sense. So in between these two compulsions appears someone like B.R. Ambedkar. For the longest time, left unwritten, if not actively written out, of anti-colonial history. Okay? Now, what I want to propose here is that this is in the most succinct, perhaps hopefully not too succinct, but in a very short fashion, the leaving behind of Ambedkar from these two modes of thinking about post-colonial democracy and democracy by and large in the global South, let alone democracy on a planetary scale, the leaving behind of figures like Ambedkar, but not Ambedkar only. There have been other figures and other thinkers who have been left behind, or were for a large part left behind in this global story of democratic triumph or anti-colonial victories. Their work was reduced to or interpreted simply as concerned with specific problems that attached itself to specific milieus in which they were born or raised. In the United States, think of the civil rights tradition, in which someone like Martin Luther King Jr. is quoted by an entire spectrum of figures from the left to the extreme reactionary far right. But he can be quoted like that precisely because he can be A, cited and his words repeated out of context, and B, paradoxically, by nailing him to that very context. And this is the paradox of being Ambedkar. On the one hand, citing and quoting Ambedkar for purposes that have nothing to do with Ambedkar. And on the other hand, doing so precisely so that the revolutionary power of Ambedkar's thinking of human freedom remains confined to, in fact, nailed to the moment and context of its birth. Not only to the context of the birth of Ambedkar's notion of freedom, but nailed to the birth of Ambedkar himself. So we have a paradoxical figure about whom, as late as 2009, a senior Indian scholar in North America can ask, tell me, does Ambedkar really think about human freedom? He thinks about human freedom and is difficult to grasp as a thinker of human freedom because Ambedkar thinks of freedom not simply as an anti-colonial project, which is important to him. Ambedkar thinks of freedom not primarily as a fight simply against the empire, but as a moral project against our worst impulses. A fight against those impulses is not the fight for national self-determination. A fight against those impulses that cripple our moral life is not simply won when an empire leaves. For Ambedkar, the primary question is not how colonialism was defeated. The primary question for Ambedkar was, who comes after the anti-colonial subject? And that is what I mean in the title of this lecture. For Ambedkar, thinking about freedom requires not simply the glorification, and this continues today, requires not simply the glorification of the anti-colonial movement, which was, of course, studded with episodes and acts of heroic virtue. But the real problem of freedom for Ambedkar is not anti-colonial triumph, or the real limit to human freedom, the real frontier of human freedom is not anti-colonial victory. The real question for him is what happens afterwards? And it is that question that he poses in the Constituent Assembly in his famous November 1948 speech, when he asks, almost mournfully, almost prophetically, will we keep our independence or will we lose it again? Part of our difficulty, and as I was saying, part of our inability to see in Ambedkar a thinker of human freedom stems from this tyranny, this theoretical weight that we carry from the anti-colonial and the post-colonial triumphalism. Because here is a thinker who stands outside of that glorified struggle, not because he's for the empire, not because he thinks the British should not leave, but because he thinks of freedom, the problem of freedom, as distinct from our independence. And this is what makes the silence on Ambedkar both so powerful, and for us who want to think with him and rescue his way of thinking about freedom, so crippling. The second important element here of how to think with Ambedkar as he thinks about human freedom is that Ambedkar himself never systematically writes a treatise on freedom per se. Right? So this gives an impression to people who want, quick, defining, definitive answers, a way out, an exit, where they can say, there is no thinking of freedom in Ambedkar. This happens precisely because the entire tradition of thinking about freedom is trapped in the anti-colonial movement. It is fascinating that in much of post-colonial theory, for example, to take one example, there are other ways of thinking about the anti-imperial projects. Even today, the concern remains squarely around the dialectic of violence and non-violence. But even in that dialectic, Ambedkar finds no place. But that's only because we have failed to read him. And in some cases, we actively refuse to read him. I think that thinking with Ambedkar as he thinks about freedom requires, in Ambedkar's own words, what Ambedkar calls in his 1946 book, Who Were the Shudras, an archaeology. It requires us to dig up traces and elements from the past, not because they can be fitted into a national sequence, but because they appear in our moral universe still as residues of a thinking that has been lost. So he's a thinker in that sense, not so much of direct freedom, not so much of direct triumph, but actually a theorist of what it means to lose freedom entirely. Because think of freedom, and this is a philosophical point, that I want to make here. Part of the problem with the moral and political imagination we have around this word, freedom, is that often we do not register freedom until the moment we come in close proximity to those who have lost it entirely, or we have. The problem of freedom is that it appears in the world, its importance appears in the world precisely in its discipline.
Connection lost হয়ে গেছে মনে হচ্ছে.
Am I back online?
Yes, you are back. Please continue.
So one issue there in thinking about freedom is that it appears in the world precisely in its loss. And I would suggest that it is precisely because of this ambiguous character most about losing freedom. The man was barred from drinking water from the faucet from the tap in his school. I think there's a network. Am I back now again?
Yes, you are back. Please continue. No problem.
Yeah. So with that focus on the loss that Ambedkar has on the loss of freedom appears distinctive moments in his political trajectory in which he articulates his theory of human freedom. But again, as we were saying a minute ago, to grasp Ambedkar's conception and theory of human freedom is to engage in what he himself calls an archaeology. This is not a historical project. This was not a genealogical project in which one thing leads to another and the past explains the present. Quite to the contrary, Ambedkar's problematic, his defining perplexity around which his thinking is arranged is precisely how little of our present is explained by our past. How little of our euphoria about self-determination is actually explained by the loss of human dignity and freedom upon which it has built itself. Right? And the anti-colonial tradition sees autonomy, Ambedkar sees a system of rules where the anti-colonial political tradition focuses on larger issues of systems or tantra. Ambedkar focuses on smaller virtues, primary virtues like courage. Does his remarkable statement in both Annihilation of Caste, eventually in the Buddha and his Dhamma, his 1956 work, which he writes in great pain himself, great physical pain, and eventually passes away right after the publication of the book. There are two ways of being in the world, he says. There is living by principles, and there is living by rules. Right? Living by principles means you have the freedom to act. Living by principles means you will never surrender to tyranny. Living by principles, above all, means that to you, the freedom of others will always come before your own freedom or self-rule. This is the expression he develops in the 30s and 40s. As we know, Annihilation of Caste is written in 1936. That the truest form of freedom is the freedom of others. It's not my own freedom. It's not my self-mastery. It's not simply my control over my own passions. Those things are ascetic and non-political. Political freedom appears in the world first and foremost, and it is in the final instance the freedom of others. I'm only as free as the other. This is why he says the principle, living by principle, the principle of freedom means the freedom to act. Living by rules means rules are your government. Rules govern you. And the rule is that which breaks you. And at the end of that formulation is this brilliant sentence where he says, either the rule breaks you or you break the rule. That is the principle of freedom that resonates with the revolutionary tradition. Even the anarchic tradition, not anarchism, which is a different doctrine altogether, but an anarchic formulation of freedom in which freedom comes before the law. Freedom appears in the world not as a gift from the masters. Freedom appears in the world not because someone gives it to us. Freedom comes in the world when we break the rule. Not by violence, but by force. Not by destruction of others, but by a courageous embrace of those who we are barred to even touch. The question for Ambedkar is, are we capable of imagining that freedom in which we will be able to break the rule that constrains us from giving others freedom? In his unfinished autobiography, Waiting for a Visa, there's a fragment. Ambedkar never, as we know, Ambedkar never finishes his autobiography. There is a fragment in which he describes a Bombay doctor who goes to treat a Dalit woman. He initially does not know that she is Dalit or outcast or untouchable. So he goes to her house. And as soon as he enters the house and begins to examine her, he realizes that she's an outcast. And right there, as he's going to touch her, perhaps to check her pulse, who knows, he stops. He says, I cannot touch her, and goes away. The woman dies. And the last line of that fragment in his autobiography is simply, the Hindu would prefer to be inhuman than touch the untouchable. End quote. The greatest loss of our freedom comes not from the active spilling of blood. The greatest loss of our freedom comes not from overt actions of war and killing. Sometimes the greatest loss of our freedom comes simply in acts of indifference and hesitation. That hesitation of a doctor, that voluntary and involuntary seizure, we will never know what it is that compels us towards that moment of pure indifference, where we would let someone die rather than touch her or him. The funny thing about this sort of indifference is that it is counterintuitive. That is to say, and I want to perhaps say this as we wind down the final few minutes, and then we'll open it to discussion. Perhaps what is counterintuitive about this sort of indifference that cripples human freedom, this counterintuitive moment in which we hesitate to touch someone out of sheer indifference or sometimes through momentary hesitations, is that it is much easier to save a life than let it die. That's the tragic absolute that Ambedkar is grappling with. The tragedy here is not that an entire society turns towards violence. He's not concerned with that. What he's concerned with are small, almost unthinkable acts of indifference and cruelty, in which freedom is lost precisely when it is so much easier to act out of the principle of freedom. Freedom is lost precisely when it is easier to have it. That's the aporia or the paradox of Ambedkar's political philosophy. That is the paradox that he grapples with. Why do we end up losing freedom to act precisely when it is easier to act in freedom, in concert, together, for someone else, with the belief that the first freedom is the freedom of the other, and that my freedom means nothing if my neighbor is not free? this is why he writes in his 1943 tribute to Rana Day, in that essay, Rana Day, Gandhi and Jinnah. So it's a remarkable expression of freedom. Very simple, he says, the secret of freedom is courage. That's it. The secret of freedom is courage, but courage is born only by the combination of an individual to a collective. Ambedkar is rescuing in this essay the idea of freedom from nationalist hands. And articulating a notion of freedom that does not depend on numbers. Rather, it depends on solidarities. Because the sort of unfreedom, the vast swath of our population that is left unfree, unequal, violated, untouched, relegated to the shadows, that number and their suffering and pain is incalculable. We cannot calculate it. He says it in an expression, he says, human inequality is such and caste inequality is such that it can never be measured through mathematical exactitude. No matter how exact our science, no matter how rigorous our statistical procedure, this unfreedom can never be captured by modern measure, because there's something really ancient about it. There's something really old, almost timeless about it. As a young student at Columbia University in New York, Ambedkar writes about this timelessness or stasis. He says, like a weed on the surface of a pond, it just hangs there. This monster. Without any gravity or support. It is right in our midst, and we refuse to see it. To recover freedom from that weightless monster, his expression, will need time. And this is where I want to end and open it to discussion. For Ambedkar, freedom is about time. Taking back time, but also giving time. Freedom is about care and rigor. In Who Were the Shudras, he says, to rescue that degree, that story, that epic of freedom is not simply a historical task. It's an archaeological task, because it is like bringing together old cities that we have lost to that have been lost to our collective amnesia. We have forgotten how free we used to be. To recover a politics of resistance requires, he says, in the same passage, piecing together bones of an extinct species. And that can come only from giving time to this politics of what he calls paleontology. To think about freedom after anti-colonialism is a paleontology in progress. We need to bring the broken bones of an extinct species, that species that was once free and then subjugated. Unless we recover that other tradition of thinking about freedom, we will not simply lose democratic life, we will lose that very subject for which this entire edifice has been created, that anti-colonial subject. We can keep talking about the glories of the anti-colonial struggle, and we will keep losing it unless we understand that freedom, human freedom, cannot be reduced to questions of self-determination and state. That for us, it is a fundamentally moral question. It is a question of our moral psychology. It is, above all, a question of why we find it easier to neglect others, why we take that treacherous route of letting others perish in their unfreedom when it is much easier for us to live together. Why is our democracy so indifferent? And unless we break out of that mold of thinking that focuses on anti-colonial triumphs, we will never manage to ask this question. We will never manage to think through this immense burden of our collective indifference. This is why he asks whether we will keep our independence or we will lose it again. So I'll stop there, perhaps, and I'll be happy to take questions. I don't want to overshoot the time, so.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, for a fascinating lecture, illuminating lecture. I have already requested the participants to post the questions in the chat box. They are coming one by one. But I request Professor Chakraborty, Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University, to initiate the discussion. Sir.
No, I don't have any questions, to be very frank, Aishwary, because the arguments which you put forward are familiar to me, because I read your book, Radical Equality in Between Lines. And I'm very happy that you are still, pursuing that kind of argument. And, I just would like to make a comment here, not a question. The comment is that before I came to Visva-Bharati, I was under the impression that Gandhi and Ambedkar were the two giant intellectuals of, as you said, anti-colonial campaign. But, having read Rabindranath Tagore, I found that, unless and until we integrate Tagore's ideas with those of Gandhi and Ambedkar, we'll not be able to understand the complex characteristics of our anti-colonial movement. Because Tagore, as early as late 19th century, wrote many novels, wrote many, dance drama, poems, critical essays, which really talked about most of the ideas which Ambedkar, later articulated. I mean, he referred to 25th November 1949 speech of Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly. You'll be surprised to know that if you read a novel, Rajarshi, which was published in 1888, and you'll find there is a kind of reverberation of the ideas of Ambedkar and that of Tagore as early as 1888. So now, I have changed little bit of, I've changed my, I wouldn't say completely, but I have changed my approach to Indian nationalism simply because I admit that my understanding of Indian nationalism was little, limited, simply because I focused merely on the so-called mainstream thinkers. Ambedkar now can be considered to be mainstream nowadays, and thanks to your work and thanks to many of us who are working. But somehow or the other, Rabindranath Tagore's ideas, because he wrote mostly in Bangla. Unless and until you understand Bangla, it's very difficult to understand the nuanced, meaning of what he had in mind. And secondly, he is not widely publicized because he was confined to Bengal basically, and he is, unfortunately, he is boxed as a novelist, as a songwriter, as a playwright. But after having gone through these texts, I find that he was equally a very innovative political thinker. And especially in that context, I mean, he probably, I think that he was an intelligent person. So he couched his arguments against British state in such a way so that he didn't get caught as an anti-national. So, and because he comes from a rich family, and that family has that kind of, acumen to cover up their ultimate, ideological preferences. So, Aishwarya, I request you, to just, supplement, some of the ideas which you put forward today. I mean, they are fair enough if you simply read it with reference to Ambedkar. But now, if you expand it to take into account the views of Tagore as well, you said there are many unknown thinkers. I mean, you kept talking about that. Many unknown thinkers who immensely contributed to the anti-colonial sentiments. So, anti-colonial impulses. I mean, you are using the term impulses. I think, Tagore constitutes an important pillar of these anti-colonial impulses. And if you, since you are interested in Indian political thought, and I don't know how long I'll remain active intellectually. So, I mean, I'm just forwarding this idea to you that in course of time, please look at the writings of Tagore. I mean, for English writings, Shishir Das published 3 volumes. The English writings of Rabindranath Tagore. They are all more than 1,000 pages, and Nityapriya Ghosh published another volume. So there you get a glimpse of what Tagore wrote in Bangla, which was translated to English. So that will help you, to substantiate some of the fundamental, ideas which you considered universal, just like me, with reference to the ideas of Rabindranath Tagore as well. So that's my comment. But I'm sure there are many who would like to ask you questions, because to have the mountain in front of Muhammad, it is a great pleasure for all of us. So I think I'm sure there will be many questions, but I'm really delighted to listen to you. And as I said, after having read your book, I was so enriched. And today, by reiterating those views, I'm happy that you still, continue to pursue that line of thinking. So best of luck and enjoy the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shubhayu. Shuru koro.
Thank you, sir. Professor Kumar, there are some questions in the chat box. So would you like to take it up one by one, or should I club it together?
You can. Why don't we take the first 2 one by one, and then we can.
Okay. The first question is from Surita Basu, faculty. I read the question. In the age of continuous hegemonic practices, particularly by global media, how do you think the perception and practice of freedom can be recovered or inspired?
Yeah, That's that is such an important question. Partly because that's actually a brilliant question, because it connects some of the long-standing struggles we have had, philosophically speaking, in conceptualizing human freedom, with the constantly rapidly changing mediatic universe. And I think one thing we have to do more carefully is to think through this kind of relationship, precisely this relationship that your question actually hits upon, this relationship between mediation by different kinds of infrastructures on the one hand, and the nature of freedom that we have come to inherit as our primary right. Remember that the 20th century, apart from the technological advancements that are now in full flow, the groundwork was laid down by the final decades of the 20th century, and now they're in full flow, including social media and so on. One of the in the middle of that entire transformation, the defining political event that occurs in the last century is the replacement of the idea of civic virtues, which is part of the longer Republican tradition, by the new conception, theory, and struggle for civil rights. Right? And I think we need to return to that moment when one was replaced by the other, and rethink in light of our contemporary mediatic conundrums, perplexities, even catastrophes, that relationship between virtue and rights. And I think part of what is becoming extremely troubling to the larger political project of thinking and rethinking about human freedom is that the mediatic universe or our moral universe that is saturated by, let alone framed and scaffolded by, new media, the relationship between virtue and rights has almost died. Like that kind of co-creative relationship. It's almost, colloquially, it's almost like because you are online, you have the right to say anything and do anything, right? We have confused access with right. Even though we believe that access is a right and ought to be a right. Think of online schooling in the last 2 years of the pandemic. In that sense, access to online education should be and ought to be a new right. But that access cannot become or cannot let to morph into the right to violate others' dignity. And I think in order to, that cannot be confused with freedom to do anything online. And I think a part of the problem your question raises is a very important problem, is to how to think of freedom when it's confused with the right to violate, simply because new media allows us or gives us this kind of concentrated, it's a paradoxical formulation perhaps, concentrated anonymity. Right? And I think we can recover that, to come finally to your most direct question, we can recover that by rethinking and re-articulating that relationship between virtue and rights. Because in the end, human freedom is simply our ability to manage this relationship, to live with this relationship between virtue and rights.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. The next question is from Urna. She wrote, near the end, what did you mean by freedom is taking back time?
Right. Yeah, that's excellent. So, and I'm glad you raised this question. You know, one important thing, theory of caste oppression that appears in Ambedkar is caste as a theft of time. Right? Think of, now he does not say it in as many words. He never says caste is a theft of time, but what he's really trying to articulate is a social world, our social world, in which we forget that so many things we take for granted, as if we are entitled to them, actually comes from the simple fact that we have the time to do that. Right? Where does that time come from? Think of the morning puja in which, you know, you need flowers, and this gardener's boy, not even the gardener, the boy, he runs around the house, he runs in the morning, gets you the morning flowers for the puja, and he comes in. You have, you know, the matriarch or the patriarch, actually, of the family, just out of a purifying cold bath, comes and, you know, grabs the bunch of flowers that he will use in his prayer that morning. He takes the flowers from the boy, but he'll not touch the boy. These are the sorts of moral psychological examples you find in figures like Ambedkar, and as Professor Chakrabarti is very rightly, very importantly suggesting, in figures like Tagore. Right? Small elements of literary emplotment become larger examples of universal strife. This is a moment of strife. We just don't see it as such. This is a moment of separation, of distancing as dignity. Right? Now, we can give 2 hours to prayer. We could give 7 hours to our exam preparations and so on, as we all must, because that is also Ambedkar's point, that truth requires rigor, it requires time. It's painstaking. It's like paleontology. You have to piece together these bones in order to tell a story again. You have to paint a new work of art, he says. I'm a painter, he said. And again, this is to that point about Tagore. He says, without literature, without painting and art, there is no way we can grasp this enigma that is freedom. Right? And to engage in that requires time. During the Mahad Satyagraha in the late 20s, as many of us know, Ambedkar famously burns a copy of the Manusmriti. But what few actually remember is that Ambedkar says it's easy to burn a copy of something. The task, the real insurrectionary, insurgent, revolutionary task should be to master the text, unquote, master the text. That mastery, whose right has been sequestered away from the vast swath of our population. That sort of mastery requires time. And a vast swath of our population does not have that time, because that time has been taken away from them. They would rather be scavengers. They would rather be tillers. They would rather be weavers. They would rather be gardeners rather than reading texts. That is why the freedom he has in mind, and I'm really glad you brought this point out. The freedom that is truly anchored in the freedom of others is the freedom in which we are all equal in the time we have in this world. Time not simply as a measure of our existence, but time that we have in order to build something new. As an architect does. Right? Along with Tagore are figures like Hannah Arendt, are figures like Judith Shkler, are figures like James Baldwin, which speaks to, again, the point about Tagore and the literary imagination. Here is James Baldwin, a playwright, who leaves America in disgust and yet returns to the problem of racism, because that is where the loss of his time in the world begins. Caste is a theft of someone else's time that we have used for purposes of our own mastery. The destruction of that caste system is the precondition to what Ambedkar calls the indestructibility of our union. We can be one again. We can be, by which he doesn't mean one sovereign. We can be whole again. We can become whole again. We can become indestructible if we recognize freedom as the freedom to take back our time, and therefore to give time, give back time.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. We are moving to the next one. Aruna Dattagupta writes, thank you for that scintillating exposition of Ambedkar's vision of freedom. If I am not mistaken, the dichotomy between rules and principles presupposes that rules are institutional and static, while principles are individual, conscience-driven, and instinctual. But what if rules plead to be founded on principles, and principles eventually congeal into rules? Does a possible dynamic relationship between these two pose a threat to the integrity of principles?
The most succinct answer to that question would be yes. I think I share your worry, I share your concern, and I share the reservation you have there about one congealing into the other. Absolutely. I do think that Ambedkar worries about this problem as well. And throughout the 30s and the 40s, but especially the 40s, when he starts to write on the national question. We know that Thoughts on Pakistan is published in 1940. Thoughts on Linguistic States is published in that decade. Following up to these larger works of political thought and political theory, in fact, appeared the more archaeological studies of moral philosophy, especially who were the Shudras, followed by the untouchables. And I think he's very, very concerned about what happens to the principle of freedom when it is overtaken and consumed by the logic of rules. And you are right to read my lecture as an articulation of the principle as that which is anchored in moral knowledge. Right? I wouldn't say self-knowledge, because Ambedkar is critical of the idea of the self. In fact, this is one reason why he never comes down to finishing his autobiography. Not because he believes that the self should not matter, but because precisely as you are laying out in your question, the moment the self becomes the site for an articulation of an exemplary mode of living, the moment we start taking self-knowledge to be some sort of universal template, we lapse into a system of rules. Right? The principle is non-exemplary. It should not, Ambedkar says somewhere later in his life, I don't want devotees and disciples and followers. I want readers. I don't want people who live like me. I want people who take my living forward. Right? The threat to principle comes from rules insofar as rules are institutional. Principles for Ambedkar are moral, but in a collective social world, this principle can be encapsulated in a radical constitutionalism. That is what a constitution is. Our act of faith in one another is its only principle. Otherwise, as he says in 1950, people say, I am the architect of this constitution, but I'll be the first one to burn it. Right? That's Ambedkar's critique of over-institutionalization. So here is Ambedkar's aporia. Here is what he struggles with. Here's the contradiction he wants to think through and perhaps even overcome. How to think of the Constitution. That is to say, the constitutional principle, which is fundamentally, let us not forget, an anarchic principle. The Constitution comes before all laws. Laws flow from it, right? So the paradox for Ambedkar, especially Ambedkar, as opposed to other liberal thinkers who tout Constitution as something that will save the Republic. The Constitution will not save the Republic. The people must save the Constitution first. So the aporia is that this constitutional principle must be adhered to in its institutional form without becoming a site or an excuse for over-institutionalization of our politics. Right? The politics of our democratic everyday cannot be reduced to a dialectic between the citizen and the police in very broad terms, because that's what happens when democracies start to unravel. Politics is reduced to this fight between the citizen and the police. And one thing that we must add to that last question about time is that part of this democratic degeneration is the appearance of what we call judicial delay, of judicially sanctioned neglect. That is when we know that the Constitution has become an excuse for over-constitutionalization. That is when we know that principles have congealed into, perhaps morphed or mutated into simple rules. But simply because they're palpable, not because they are in their structure very simple. What Ambedkar means by rules is a logic, an entire structure or scaffold of our obedience to authority. Okay?
Thank you, Professor Kumar. Oh, sure. Please continue. Please continue.
Oh, no, please. Let's take we'll come to that. This is, yeah, absolutely good.
The next one is from Sudev Pratim Basu. He writes, love the nuanced lecture. How do you react to the concepts of empire as proposed by Michel Hardet and Antonio Negri? Do you think a conformist structure of history, erasing boundaries, will help highlighting plurality?
Sorry, say again. Do you think? I lost you there.
Do you think a conformist structure of history, erasing boundaries, will help highlighting plurality?
Yeah, so now here is a good example of a book that does some of the work that anti-colonial or post-colonial theorists have used to varying degrees. Not always, but they have, and it's Hart and Negri are important in that way because they bring the conception, the framework of empire up to our global and contemporary present, and I think part of their power lies in trying to examine how, to use your word, plurality, but also how heterogeneity and movement or mobility can, cut through or break through our systems of domination, and I think there. Plurality is a very interesting idea, partly because in many ways it is actually true, both practically and philosophically, that the more plural we are, perhaps the less bound to tyranny we might be. It is right. Now think of that, and I want to, rather than replying perhaps directly to your question, I want to build on this question for just a couple of minutes. If you look at Hannah Arendt's Human Condition, the 1958 classic, just 2 years after Ambedkar writes the Buddha and his Dhamma. Remember, it's the same year, that same decade that Thoughts on Pakistan and her classic of political theory, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is published. So these two figures are navigating that moment when empires have been, what's the word? At least the French and the British empires have liquidated to some extent. They're writing at that moment of decolonization, but they are also writing at the moment of statelessness, both in Europe and elsewhere, which is why the minority treaties and the figure of the minority becomes so central in their works, right? In Arendt, and again, I have to say that, when you read Tagore's nationalism, and I'm absolutely certain all of us here, all of you have read Tagore's nationalism. This conception of this problem he has of the subterfuge of modern nation state and nationalism is very palpable in a host of later thinkers. And this is how Hannah Arendt works through this. In The Human Condition, she argues actually that in societies that people do not worship one God, that is to say, in polytheistic societies, sovereignty is always splintered in a million directions by plurality. And because sovereignty is splintered in a million directions, there appears on their horizon, that is to say, on the horizon of these societies, the glimmer of true human freedom. Right? So, to your point, plurality, according to Arendt, and in fact, not any plurality, not liberal plurality. She's talking about polytheistic societies and their plurality, their system of worshiping 100 gods. She says, because in those societies, sovereignty is not achieved by even God, that is one God, unlike in monotheism. These are the societies in which freedom makes its appearance beyond the compulsions the pathologies of sovereign power. And that is where I think you pick up on the right notion or concept there on plurality. Ambedkar asks the same question at an angle. And he posits this problem in this way. What if it is precisely the loss of a sovereign center? What if it is precisely the emptiness at the middle of this moral and philosophical, most importantly, an epistemological universe? That is to say, the very universe of the universe of our very language, linguistic world. What if the emptiness at the center of these societies that worship 100 gods were to become an alibi or an excuse to dissolve all forms and demands of political responsibility? Or in political language, let's say, what if the silence of the sovereign is an excuse for moral unaccountability? Okay. In that case, what happens to plurality? Especially the plurality of the gods. What happens is that it becomes very difficult to create a moral universe in which responsibility means something. This is why in Annihilation of Caste, he writes that the real responsibility towards religion, the first religious responsibility, is to destroy the religion that works with this irresponsible center. What greater act of faith there can be than destroying this irresponsible religion, which works by distributing its authority, whether it's, Hinduism or other cult and mythic practices and so on. Ambedkar builds on that problem of plurality. So can plurality fight back or push back against the tyrannies of sovereign power? Yes. But the question we need to immediately ask along with Ambedkar is, why does plurality become an instrument in that tyrannical structure of power? How does it become that? So on the one hand, it can be liberating from all sorts of dominations. And on the other, it can become a justifying or a legitimating device that dissolves all political accountability, all crime, all atrocity. There will be laws and rules, but there will be no freedom. So I think there are two different threads in your question, and I think we need to take both those threads seriously.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. I think there is no other question left in the chat box.
Shweta, one more question. So Shweta, one more question in the chat box. Please look into.
Okay, so another is one from Urna. What, in your view, is the distinction between anti-coloniality and post-coloniality? What tensions animate this difference, if there is one?
Yeah, that's the one difference. I mean, there are very there are very heterogeneous histories around both these terms and categories, of course. But I think the one that we ought to foreground before everything else is that the anti-colonial tradition is much more universal and radically cosmopolitan than the post-colonial tradition made it out to be. So one is the sequence issue. The anti-colonial tradition is an event. It's a tradition that is both an account of an event, which is to say the event of anti-colonialism, anti-colonial politics, anti-colonial struggle. And it is an event in itself, because that tradition, the anti-colonial tradition, is an event in thought. It's an event in epistemology. It is an event in our political and moral language, right? Within this tradition, as I would like to think, there is no inequality. Not because the freedom struggles around the world were not compromised by inequality, but because the tradition that looks at this struggle must look at the thinkers within this tradition as part of an event in which they are radically equal. For me, Ambedkar, Du Bois, Baldwin, they're part of a broader constellation of anti-colonial thinking, anti-colonial thought, philosophy, epistemology, if you will. In fact, Ambedkar is, in that sense, truly an epistemologist. I mean, it's not simply political and sociological questions that concern him. He is concerned with how we articulate in language, how we hide in plain language our cruelties and our oppressions. So in that sense, for him, justice is inseparable. Political justice is inseparable from epistemic justice. And this is why literature is important, because literature is the first and irrevocable right to think. It's the intensification of our capacity to think, or as Ambedkar might say, to paint, to draw. In the what I consider to be anti-colonial is heterogeneous from, I wouldn't say they are irreconcilable, although there are moments like those, is heterogeneous from what came to be called the post-colonial tradition. In one way that I think we ought to never forget, that the post-colonial tradition was marred by a certain inequality. It was marred by and compromised by a critique of the Enlightenment, of the European Enlightenment, that simply gave post-colonial nation state and nationalism a legitimating aura. This is why I write, and even in my book I do this, but there's more to be said there, like your question absolutely and rightly suggests, that this is why for so long Ambedkar never appears in the anti-colonial tradition. Because in post-colonial theory, the primary impulse is the critique of European Enlightenment tradition. And Ambedkar is way more sophisticated than any, even Gandhi is. Most important critique of the modern nation state, again, appears in Tagore, right? So I think the anti-colonial tradition or anti-colonial thought, to your point, should be taken as an event at the heart of which is a radical equality, an epistemic claim to justice that is not reducible to our self-determination. At the heart of the post-colonial tradition or post-colonial theory is the critique of the nationalist project insofar as it is derived from European Enlightenment. And I think that is why the post-colonial project, the project of post-colonial theory, exhausts itself. Because in the end, it remains constrained by the same framework as, you know, the frameworks of the region and the nation, but more importantly, the state. Perhaps the most sophisticated work of post-colonial theory, political theory, or written by a political theorist rather, would be Partha Chatterjee. Partha Chatterjee's work is concerned by those two things. If you read his book, Nationalist Thought in Colonial World, A Derivative Discourse, it's concerned by those two things. It's concerned with self-determination, which is why Nehru is the moment of arrival. And it is concerned with the state, which is why Gandhi is an instrument of passive revolution. For me, and for our generation at least, I do think that the question was not simply self-determination. The question was the problem of inequality that thrived within post-colonial epistemology itself. Right? So I would say any tradition worthy of the expression anti-colonial must have a radical equality at its heart.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. I think there is no other post in the chat box finally. So we have come to the close of the session. Thank you very much formally. Taking cue from what our Vice Chancellor said in the beginning.
Thank you so much for having me.
With a formal vote of thanks to be given by Dr. Nimai Shah.
Vice Chancellor, sir, will you like to say any final remarks, sir? VC, sir? VC, sir, would you like to say final remarks from your side?
Me?
No, VC, sir. I'm asking for VC, sir. Okay. Professor Vidit Chakraborty, sir. Okay, let's start. Maybe sir is busy on meeting. So let's start to offer formal word of thanks. And at the very outset, this is proud privilege to me to explore word of thanks in this August gathering. And at the very outset, I have no hesitation to express deep sense of regards as well as gratefulness to our today's speaker, Professor Kumar, for his thought-provoking, illuminating lectures. And to me, it is really outstanding. And how can I defend myself without saying outstanding? Because from these 2 hours, I found that our speaker is still standing. So there is no deviation. That speech is really outstanding. And as our Vice Chancellor told at the very beginning, that as you are now the members of the Visva-Bharati family, soon after this Corona crisis is over, and in your next visit to India, we on behalf of Visva-Bharati fraternity intend to have you in our conference hall in-sitting lecture. Now it is outstanding, and we are waiting for your another in-sitting lecture. So we are waiting for that day. So thank you, sir, for your very, very thought-provoking lecture. And I'm really grateful to have under your connection regarding organizing of this session. And then I would like to convey my deep regards as well as thanks to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Vidyut Chakraborty, for whom only we are just able to have this scope to listen different luminaries from global level. And soon after his joining, Sir has introduced this lecture series on 5th of January 2019. And of course, today it is a 48th lecture. And if I go division, this is the 29th online lecture beginning from the pandemic days. And earlier, another 19 lecture was in physical mode. So altogether 48 lecture, and we are listening different luminaries from different parts of the world. So we are really grateful to our Honorable VC Sir for giving us this kind of opportunity to listen the world galaxy of academics. And we are also thankful to our Registrar, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Ashish Agarwal Sir. Because of his administrative support, we are here to organize this kind of online session. And we are really thankful to the principal and the authority of Sangeet Bhavan administration in general, and Dr. Manos Bhul, Sri Suman Bhattacharya, and 4 other students, those who are actually part from the Vedic hymn of this lecture session. So please accept our deep regards and thankful to my colleagues of Sangeet Bhavan. And Dr. Subhai Chattopadhyay, yesterday evening only, I request him to moderate the session, and without thinking twice, it is his generosity and as well as the culture of Visva-Bharati Porivar. In spite of his odds, he accepted and agreed, and very efficiently he managed the session. So please accept on behalf of Visva-Bharati lecture series, Dr. Subhai Chattopadhyay, our deep regards and thanks to you. And of course, even though examination is going on and academic session is in peak nature, the faculty members, scholars, students, staff, library professionals, and officers, those who have joined to grace this occasion and to listen the occasion by online, we are really grateful on behalf of Visva-Bharati lecture series. And finally, if I would not pay my deep sense of regards and thanks to my colleague Dr. Jishnu Mondal from library, who is taking care for this technical arrangement so that we are sitting, and my respected speaker, Professor Kumar, is standing from that part of the world. That part of the another part of the world. So I would like to pay my deep thanks to my colleagues and of course the technical staff of Computer Center. Because of them, we are here to organize this session. So before to winding it up, let me pray before the Almighty. Have a good health for everyone, including Professor Kumar, and we are eagerly waiting to you, sir, in the campus in physical fashion. And really, after listening your this thought-provoking lecture, most of us would like to be the fan of your lecture, and we have no deviation but to have you in the campus in physical mode when you will come here, and our visitor will be keep in touch with you, and we want to have you the campus. So with this few words, let me formally close the formal word of thanks in this 48th online lecture session of Visva-Bharati lecture series. And if let me just seek the opinion from my VC sir if he is able to say something. Otherwise, we will conclude our session formally. Sir, will you say something? We are just tag end of the session. So with kind permission from the senior faculty members, professors, those who are on the line, and with kind permission from our today's respected speaker, Professor Kumar, let us allow to wrap up this online session and we will meet in another occasion, be it online or be it in physical mode. So ধন্যবাদ, ভালো থাকবেন প্রফেসর কুমার, and আমরা আপনাকে কিন্তু আমাদের ক্যাম্পাসে চাই। Thank you so much. Thank you.
We'll do that. We'll do that.
Thank you. I'm getting ready for the office. Hello.
Yeah, Shar is on the board. Yes, sir.
With the I am getting ready to go to the office. So I think I thank Aishwarya, and I'll request him to come back to the campus when he is able to come out of the United States and spend some time with us. And thanks a lot for an illuminating lecture. As you said, everybody was benefited by intervention, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
We'll be honored to
Thank
do
you
so.
very much, Aishwarya. Thank you, Aishwarya. Please, Esho, কখনো সুবিধা মতন just আমাদেরকে, we are one phone call away.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. I promise.
You promise, right? এটা কিন্তু তোমাকে আসতেই হবে।
Yeah.
ঠিক আছে, এবং তুমি দেখতে পাচ্ছ you have won everybody's heart. So you have to come.
Yeah.
Our Mayor was a participant. He really wrote profusely good things about you.
I'm glad. I'm so glad.
She read your book, Radical Equality, and she is going to Boston most probably to do her PhD
Brilliant.
in the Department of Philosophy on Ambedkar.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
Yeah, so she'll be in touch with you.
Yeah, would love to do that. Yeah, please let her know. I'll wait.
ভালো থেকো, সাবধানে থেকো, হ্যাঁ? ঠিক আছে।
You too. Yeah, take care of your health, and thank you so much.
Thank you.